Welcome, everybody. It's wonderful to see all these new names out there, not yet the faces, but I hope during the Q&A we'll be able to see your faces. I'm Maya Kovskaya, and the founder and director of the AMOR MUNDI Multispecies Ecological Worldmaking Lab here at Chiang Mai University. And tonight, we have a really special talk and roundtable with some great people. This is part of the speaker series called Seeking Symbiopoiesis with the More Than Human Against the Anthropocene. And we will have a talk tonight by Yogi Hendlin and a roundtable discussion with Ecological, Timo Maran, Augustine Fuentes, me, and moderated by Anshul Mukherjee. And so I'm going to give our little untraditional land acknowledgement, and then hand the floor over to Anshul, who I'll briefly introduce as well. So we acknowledge that this land on which we speak, work, and live belongs to all earthly beings, past, present, and future, including the many diverse indigenous peoples who came here and made homes long before there were nations or states. Acknowledgements are not enough, however. We need to actively begin to decolonize our relations with the natural world of which humans are but a part. Remediating ecological damage with the active help of leading roles played by traditional indigenous inhabitants who've proven their capability and will to preserve biodiversity and landscape integrity in the lands under their stewardship is a needed first step. To borrow words from Tuck and Young, decolonization is not a metaphor. So tonight, our moderator is my dear old friend from Delhi, Anshul Mukherjee. Anshul is an MPhil research scholar at Delhi University, where they are doing dissertation research, engaging formalism in literary theory and the temporal anxieties of early British rule in India, untimeliness in narrative structures and their relation to the globalizing colonial capitalism, as well as the social history of medieval Buddhism in South Asia, the recovery of Buddhism in late 19th and early 20th century India, and its relation to anti-colonial violence. I'm going to hand the floor over to Anshul now, and I will also ask that everybody turn their mics and their videos off. And Anshul, take it away. Introduce us.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Maya. I would like to welcome everyone to this talk and roundtable once again over here today. Before we begin, I would first of all like to thank our CMU affiliated hosts, without whom this would simply not be possible. They've provided us with the institutional support needed for not just this talk, but much of the series. So I would like to thank the Regional Center for Social Science and Sustainable Development at the Chiang Mai University, as well as the Integrative Center for Humanities Innovation at the Chiang Mai University. Before we just get into it, just some regular old housekeeping, I would request everyone, everyone already has, but I would request people to keep their mics off while the talk and the roundtable discussion are going on. If you could keep your videos off as well, that would be great. We're also recording this session, just so everyone knows. If I would also request people to refrain from asking questions in the chat while our speakers are speaking. If you have a question, just write it down, and then at the end, after the roundtable, when we have a Q&A session, please do feel free to enter them into the chat. I'm not sure if we'll have enough time to allow everyone to speak and ask their questions, so I might request people after the roundtable discussion to just put their questions in the chat, and I'll read them out on your behalf. So we've got that out of the way. So now I would first of all like to introduce the AMOR MUNDI Multispecies and Ecological Worldmaking Lab, for those of you who may not know about it or hearing about it for the first time. So the lab is essentially an intersectional and multidisciplinary research initiative in the Global South, which investigates how human and more than human world making and survival are mutually entangled. The aim of the lab is to grow a knowledge making community by fostering dialogues and collaborations amongst disciplines which span eco-philosophy and ecological political theory, ethology, animal, plant, and critical life studies, geography, anthropology, political and social sciences, the humanities, arts, national sciences, and so on, through research, publications, workshops, curated conversations such as these, art and science exhibitions, multi-species ethnography, and innovative pedagogy. So the title of the talk today is Ecosemiotics is Community, Interdimensional Resonance Prevents Parasitism and Supernormal Stimuli. And our speaker today is the environmental philosopher and public health scientist, Dr. Yogi Hendlin. A bit about Dr. Yogi Hendlin. He is an assistant professor at the Erasmus School of Philosophy, sustainability lead in design, impact, and technology platform, and he holds many positions elsewhere, as for example, as a research assistant, I think, at the University of California, San Francisco. His research interests include what he calls stuck but stable societal equilibria, which are driving current climate collapse and disease, and the micro interspecies makeup of human beings, as well as the complexity of life, agency, and interspeciality. For those of you who'd like to know more about him, I'm just putting his full bio over here in the chat. If you'd give me a second, you can see his publications as well as his website and where to reach him. But it's not going through. I'll try as Dr. Yogi is speaking. I'm so sorry about that. But yeah, I would like to now invite Dr. Yogi to, take over, share his screen, and get to begin our session for today. So Dr. Yogi Hendlin.
Great, thank you so much, Anshul. I'm really honored to be here with you all. And I really am looking forward to the dialogue that will ensue. So hopefully you can see my screen. And yeah, we'll be talking today, having a discussion about how is ecosemiotics community? And I think it's really fitting that this is happening on today, in the West, at least the traditional day of Valentine's, St. Valentine's. So Khop Kun to our Thai audience joining us today and participants. Thank you. And I'll just start with a quote from Thich Nhat Hanh, where Thich Nhat Hanh says, the next Buddha will be a Sangha. And what Thich Nhat Hanh means by this, I believe, is that the next Buddha will not take the form of an individual, but rather as a community, a living community practicing understanding and loving kindness and care of one another and the earth. And there's the idea of taking refuge in Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha being the community of those who are working together for evolution. My take on it. So what does it mean to open up our doors of perception, or our species-specific way of understanding the world? I call this opening up our Umwelt, based on the work of the Estonian-German theoretical biologist, Jakob von Uexküll. And so there's a story, a true story that dates back to the tsunami that happened in Southeast Asia in 2004, 2005 New Year's, where there were many villages in Sri Lanka that when they saw the elephants in their habitat going towards the hills, the villagers, because they had many generations of contact with these elephants, also followed them to the hills and thus escaped the devastation of the tsunami, which killed hundreds of thousands of people. And so many, many thousands of people were saved by following the elephants for an event that none of our human technology or apparatuses could detect, right? And so Alvin Toffler, in his preface to Ilya Prigogine and Isabel Stanger's book, Order Out of Chaos, writes, a host of intriguing issues about whether all parts of the environment are signaling all the time or only intermittently come to play. Questions about the indirect second and nth order communication that takes place, permitting a molecule or an organism to respond to signals which it cannot sense for lack of the necessary receptors. For example, a signal sent by the environment that is undetectable by organism A may be received by organism B and converted into a different kind of signal that is properly equipped to receive. It is properly equipped to receive, so that B serves as a relay or converter, and A responds to an environmental change that has been signaled to it via second order communication, right? So how can we learn to be aware of all the things that we're not aware of, right? Via paying more attention to the other beings in our world. And this, I would claim, has to do with what Charles Sanders Peirce calls the phaneron, right, or evolutionary desire. By the phaneron, Peirce means the collective total of all that is in any way, in any sense, present to the mind or at hand, regardless of whether it corresponds to any real thing or not, anything beyond even our senses. So how do we tap into that which is beyond what we are immediately filtering out, right? For example, our eyes are physically capable of seeing other forms of light, for example, ultraviolet light, but they don't, because it has proven evolutionarily disadvantageous to us. So we filter that out. So the phaneron for Peirce is part of his science of phaneroscopy, and it's this notion of being present to all that is and tapping into that. So when we look at vision, for example, bees, like humans, are trichromates, but rather than having the yellow, blue, and red that we have, they see instead blue, yellow, and ultraviolet. So if we asked, what is the real flower? Which version of the flower is the true one or the real? This would be a nonsensical question, because it's both and infinitely more, right? And so part of getting to this place of finding the diffusion patterns, the overlapping Umwelten, between how we as a species sees, and then further how our culture has distilled even other patterns of our ways of sensing the world, and the non-human Umwelt, as Lisa Javbrat, the biosemiotic artist, with this graphic of collaborative form, and finding those productive interference patterns. How can we find ways of understanding signals that are beyond our sort of native ways of understanding? And this, in a sense, is, I would say, one of the tasks of ecosemiotics. So just to back up for a moment, I am a scholar in the field of biosemiotics. And one way of looking at biosemiotics is in the words of Jesper Hoffmeyer, where he says in the subtitle to his book, Biosemiotics, they are the signs of life and the life of signs. So how signs and signals and communication operates in a way that is always beyond what we intend it to be, and also beyond the human, importantly. So in Charles Sanders Peirce's triadic semiotics, this isn't a Saussurean sort of input-output model, Peirce really centers the notion of interpretation, or what we could refer to as hermeneutics, where there are objects in the world, seen and unseen, and we are made aware of them to certain degrees, in certain ways, according to histories, but we're never seeing the thing in itself, right? But this doesn't necessarily have to be a problem. We don't have to fetishize, you could say, the nomina over the phenomena. Merely what it means is being aware of the incompleteness of any given interpretation, and also seeing how that interpretation itself can give rise to other interpretations, ad infinitum. And this isn't a linear mechanical process, rather it's the product of a living system, an interpretive organism. As Ecological has written previously in a paper on semiotic ecology, Cole discusses how ecosemiotics is sort of this bridge in some respects between biosemiotics and culture. It allows us to become aware of different forms of nature and how we represent this, and that we can, in a sense, create community in a larger way with the more than human world. So what are some of the ways in which this happens? Well, we could look at the work of Gilbert, Sapp, and Tauber in their famous Symbiotic View of Life, We Have Never Been Individuals paper. There they talk about how human beings have never been individuals. We've always been lichens. We have been this superorganism which evolved from, in the case of lichen, you have plants, bacteria, and fungi all working together to create a superorganism of lichen. And so by seeing ourselves as composed of all of our mutualists, commensalists, and parasites, and that is who we are constitutively, we start to think of ourselves in different ways. And then we get to see, okay, so what aspects of these, you could say from the skin on in ecologies affect us in which ways, right? On a biochemical level, our thoughts and emotions, this question of supervenience, right? So, if we have certain gut flora, our gut microbiome is tending towards one way rather than another. This can affect our mood, our thoughts, our emotions, right? And it can also create or alleviate, depending on its composition, our tensions, our attachments, and our resistance. We could see the work of Eduardo Kohn, for example, in Kohn's notion of overlapping Umwelten, or finding pigeons between species, common symbiosis, say with dogs. I think many of us have experience with our pets or with animals that we are intimate with in our surroundings, the birds, etc., that we see every day, that clearly have ways of communicating amongst ourselves, even if we are from different species. And then finally, there's questions of how do we entrain action or state? How do, like, two clocks that are off beat find so that they're ticking together or counter each other, but in concert? And this also can be seen as types of mimicry, intentional or not. So a small but growing body of evidence is accumulating, which reveals that the physiological division of labor by different species happening is not just on the side or peripheral, but central to all life, including our own. And I want to tell a story about this that has to do with a 1990s experiment on artificial selection, right? So William Muir's experiments in livestock breeding in the 1990s selected for the best egg-laying hen, right? So which hen is going to produce the most eggs, and how to create sort of a farm that is more productive. So they did this A/B experiment where one batch was selected individually for the best egg layers in the group. So, for example, in management, in human business, you call this sort of the rank and yank, where you take the best individuals at the top and you get rid of the ones at the bottom. And so this is sort of this model. The other segment of the experiment selected for the best egg-laying group overall. So if you had, say, 10 groups of chickens, you would find the group that in total, in aggregate, was laying the most eggs. So we know that chickens are social animals, but this multi-level selection experiment even perhaps for us led to some surprising results. The most productive egg layer in each group also turned out to be the biggest bully. So singling out and breeding these animals alone for multiple generations led to aggressive competitive action, which actually reduced group productivity and health. You literally had these productive egg-laying bullies pecking the feathers of the others and demoralizing these others who had been picked as the best egg layers in their group, but when put in a group of bullies, displayed a lot of group behavior which suppressed egg laying. Whereas the group selection, where the breeding groups that were most productive overall, by breeding those groups over and over, within 5 generations, led to 160% increase in egg output. So variation as an egg layer was overwhelmed by the toxic social dynamics created by the bullying that came with it. So perhaps one of the takeaways we can have from this research experiment by William Muir and Muir's team is that selecting for individuals doesn't work. We're always playing roles in a larger social milieu. And to ignore that we're only playing a role and that we're not, you could say, somehow have arrived at whatever position we have by ourselves, but rather that it's a social determination, I think is really important to look at. And we see this reflected all over experimental ethology as well. We see in the work of Bruce Alexander, the experiment of Rat Park, where he talks about addiction to morphine in this example. And here he talks about when you had rats that were introduced, that were addicted to morphine, introduced into a sort of Disneyland for rats with other rats they could play with, things that they could play on, that the rats chose water over morphine. They were willing to sacrifice their drug addiction in order to be more lucid so they could have more pro-social behavior. Alexander says, addiction isn't you, it's the cage you live in. Likewise, the work of Kwame Anthony Appiah, who works at NYU, shows through the philosophy of situationism that we are not static beings. Our virtue is defined through contexts, right? Ethics is collective, not individual. And an example from an experiment in the 60s, experimental psychology, Appiah gives is, you had these Princeton seminary students. They were given a lecture on the Good Samaritan, that is helping others out. The next day, they all had an appointment with the dean, a very important appointment, each one. But half of them had the parking lot that they usually go to shut off, that they couldn't go. So they had to walk an extra 10 minutes. Now, in the experiment, they planted a beggar in front of a church asking for alms, asking for some money. And those that got to park in their usual spots and were not late for their appointment gave at a much higher percentage than those that were running late, which for Appiah shows that virtue isn't about being a good person or having good character. It means setting things up in society so that our default actions allow us to be more generous, allow us to be more in aid to our fellow humans, and more than humans, I would say. And just a third point of reference here, we could look at the work of Gilbert Simondon, right, talking about pre-individual being and dephasing. So how we construct this concept of the individual is not a static one. It's something that can phase in and out and it can get larger or smaller. Alexei de Tocqueville, for example, in Democracy in America, talks about the original small New England towns as self-interest properly understood, by privileging the good of the social group, allowing one's own self-interest to be enhanced via that. And so these are some examples of how that works. And now I want to pose that perhaps it's also necessary when we talk about health. So here's a quote from David Abrams, spelled the sensuous, discussing how ecosemiotics is preventing passing disease around, right? Disease is often conceptualized as a kind of imbalance within the sick person. Yet such destructive influences within the human community are commonly traceable to a disequilibrium between that community and the larger ecological field of forces in which it is embedded. Only those persons who, by their everyday practice, are involved in monitoring and maintaining the relations between the human village and the animate landscape are able to appropriately diagnose, treat, and ultimately relieve personal ailments and illnesses arising within the village. Any healer who was not simultaneously attending to the intertwined relation between the human community and the larger, more than human field would likely dispel an illness from one person only to have the same problem arise, perhaps in a new guise, somewhere else in the community. So instead of just pushing disease around, we need to look at what healing and preventing disease requires. And this requires, you could say, from the extended evolutionary synthesis of biology, looking at the holobiont, not just our human cells, not just at symptoms, but looking at the roots of disease, looking at eubiosis and dysbiosis. And we're reminded by Gregory Bateson that these categories of separateness are heuristics themselves. They're shortcuts, right? They're sort of ways in which we understand things for instrumental purposes, but they're not to be reified, right? They're not really the case. Bateson writes, we say tree, soil, fungi, water, air. But these all interact, and there is no tree without all the other parts in the system. So the divisions are useful, but it is worth remembering they are arbitrary, not precise definitions of the state of nature. So this I see as an important antidote to the toxic individualism, which is at the main driving force of our ecological and social crisis, right? This idea of this is me, I'm an individual, these are my things, I own them. And so I'm going to ask you in the next few slides just to come on a thought experiment with me, talking about what I've come to think of as, the more than we gloss as material realm, but still I believe it to be material. So it's this notion that most of us are aware that in modern physics, we postulate string theory, where there are at least 11 dimensions. All the rest of our sciences, however, exist as if we were only interacting with 4 dimensions. So my question is, where did the other 7 dimensions go? Did they simply comply with our confining our sciences to 4 dimensions? Did they refuse to interact with us because we pretend that they do not in these ways? Or are there, for example, n+1 dimensions to any type of taxonomy that we could invent, and that we are always, like in following the elephants, we are always looking at signals from A that allow us to see into other realms that we may not be aware of. And so when we talk about this in terms of you could say the ecodelic space. That's a term from Richard Doyle, because ecodelic experiences are not mind manifesting, they're environment, set and setting, and intention manifesting. And so on this short thought experiment, I'm just going to quote from a couple authors that suggest that what we're looking at is something of an ecology of the invisible, right? And it's the prospect that just as our bodies are a complex concoction of native cells, bacteria, viruses, symbiotic and parasitic organisms, there may be a similar psychic ecology of various forms of consciousness or sentience. And that's Daniel Pinchbeck. And what Asher Walden suggests is that there are many of the thoughts and feelings we experience as our own are not really our own at all, but genetically alien, quasi-independent selves which exist in symbiosis with the native aspects of our conscious lives. These, to continue the quote, are the mysterious and mischievous beings that have been called at various times gods, spirits, angels, demons, elves, archetypes, mass delusions, aliens, neuroses, and so on. They constitute a rather heterogeneous collection of forms of consciousness that have their own psychologies, their own moral principles, their own likes and dislikes. But similar to the microbiome in our guts, they are not useless. They serve a prophylactic, a protective, and other functional purpose, which we are deeply dependent on. We might not be aware of all the purposes they serve, all of their functions, but if they exist, we might think that they exist for a reason rather than just as fragments or artifacts of our imagination. So if we welcome all of these other entities as full citizens of our psychic ecology, Walden writes, we will be all the stronger for it. So I see this regenerative ecology of our spirit as healing, multidimensional healing, right? As ecodelic experience, as a form of peacemaking. And why is this important? Because as you know, I've noted in some of my previous work, we've created a society that does not honor our emotions, does not honor our mind, does not honor our bodies, right? It's creating designer anxieties, selling the antidotes to the problems created by those selling the antidotes. And in the process, taking away our support systems, our ecological commons, our epistemic commons, our emotional nurturing commons, and then getting people hooked on products as an ersatz that barely work enough so that we'll keep using them, but we become dependent. It's sort of, you know, dealing with the trauma in a way that perpetuates the trauma instead of healing it. So as Martine Prechtel has written, you know, what we've created with a world based on products and buying and selling and industrialism is a case where one can spend one's whole lifetime missioning on behalf of what's killing us, right? This is a sort of, you know, we identifying with the very thing that's harming us. And in psychology, this is, I would say, a very prevalent issue. As Jason Moore has written, capitalism's metabolism is inherently an open flow system that continually exhausts its sources of nourishment. Stuckler and Siegel, in looking at disease in society, they write, as society breeds more disease, our response has been to redesign our bodies to fit our increasingly unhealthy environments, rather than to check the harms of our industrial society. Rather than trying to create a world in which all can flourish, we've tried to remove the individual human, the privileged individual human, from those harms if they can pay for it, right? And as Aldo Leopold wrote to his good friend William Vogt, that the situation is hopeless, nonetheless should not prevent us from doing our best. And this is where I advocate for queering ecological epistemologies, not as some sort of niche, oh, it'd be nice to do, or it's ethical or anything like that, but as a survival methodology. So if we believe that our knowledge of the world is constrained by our ability to perceive or understand the world, then it would seem that concentrating as much of our energies as possible on toying with and expanding our perception is a priority. While we can posit all sorts of protocols, until we actually are able to go outside the cave and experience them for ourselves to be true, according to whichever measure we're currently most attached to, ontology becomes guesswork. Hence, ehi passiko, which the Buddha said, come and see for yourself. Yet if our culture seems dead, set on constraining all explorers to only abide by certain epistemological rules, such a monoculture is likely to produce rather than discover blind spots. And if we're seeing more and more sort of dysfunctionalities and dysbiosis from our current way of doing things, we need a plurality of experiences and experiments based on those experiences of reality to allow us to listen to those signals which we are not being taught to listen to. Any epistemological paradigm that is blind spot productive by design will weaken that culture's ability to deal with black swans. For such black swans only appear in the context of the epistemological straitjacket. And this is one of the reasons why I'm so fond of learning and listening to indigenous ways of knowing, which I believe have taken account not just for the signaling amongst the animals and the plants and the ecosemiotic features of the landscape, of the wind, of the elements, but also to the invisible realms, or so-called invisible realms, that there is a tradition of attending to all of these ways of knowing, so that we can get more information than we otherwise would have. And so what I'm suggesting here is not that we become heroic individuals in any sense. What we need to be alive and flourish is not something of ours, not some great task. Rather, it's a gift, a fortune of co-arising interdependence. Like the chicken experiment, instead of lionizing those few who manage to escape bad situations, why don't we create less bad situations for people to need to escape from? Making it easier for people to do the right thing is the heart of situationism. This means designing an ecological world of flourishing based on ecological patterns, you could say, of succession. And here, I think it's important to return to the necessity of logical incongruence. Cole, for example, describes that biology is definitionally a logically incongruent system. For if it were logically congruent, it would be predictable, machine-like. You know, we might know the old saying that to err is human, to forgive is divine. But to err, to make errors, mistakes, is biological, and to learn is biosemiotic. Machines have errors, but only according to external people like us who count those errors as errors. The machines don't count their errors as errors. They don't see them as mistakes that they can learn from. Right? That is part of a biosemiotic process. So rather than just physics or chemistry, which at least in the 20th century paradigm were seen based on necessity rather than containing degrees of contingency, biology and everything that springs forth from life attends to the changes in habits that fellow organisms display through our own learning processes. So to put in other words, semiosis makes behavior unpredictable. And it's that unpredictability that instead of just paying no attention to it or forgetting the causation links, we can make sense of it, I believe, through attending to our environment more. And what happens when we don't? What happens when we are not paying attention to unpredictability? Well, as Fabian Scheidler writes in the end of the Mega Machine, the only time that people do behave like billiard balls is when they're given commands. The officer says halt, and predictably the recruit stands still. The foreman says faster, and the worker speeds up. The teacher says, Kevin, you stay after class, and the boy will indeed stay. Commands, as a unique form of communication, simulate the mechanics of the inanimate world, not inanimate as the more than human world, but the machine-like, the dead world for inanimate beings, right? The idea of machines as servants, as slaves doing our bidding. However, people who carry out and simulate mechanical behavior are not actually turned into machines. Forcing someone to behave like a machine can lead to unpredictable and unpleasant consequences. If Kevin is forced to stay behind, if consistently, if the worker is always pushed to work faster, if the recruit is repeatedly ordered to stand still, they may eventually react quite unpredictably and do inexplicable things. When Kevin starts to torment his little sister, the worker gets hooked on drugs, the recruit gets drunk and beats somebody up, the teacher, the foreman, and the officer may never see the connection. Command structures create the false assumption that people can be treated like automatons all their lives without ever retaliating. So there is no elsewhere, right? Commands are thorns and pokes into those who have taken orders and can only be gotten rid of or most easily by passing them down to people elsewhere. This is hegemony, right? However, this elsewhere cannot be seen within the context of our current linear thinking. And when we dislocate the symbolic form, right, of human language, English, for example, from the world of physical objects and create these gaps, these empty spaces where meaning is vacant for grifting or for parasites or for mimetic contagion or rentier seeking to enter and set up shop, we're creating a virtualization where anything can occur on this level because it is not connected to the material world, because it's not actually connected to our bodies. So in this schematic from Terence Deacon's The Symbolic Species, which talks about the differences between icons, which are sort of like a symbol of fire, indexes, which you could say is smoke, and symbols, which is writing out the word F-I-R-E. We can find ourselves disconnected from the synesthetic nature of reality. And without synesthesia, we tend to get too caught up in certain ways of thinking, which you could say are positive feedback loops. Not that they're good, they're not positive in that sense, but that they keep on reproducing the same sort of thinking in the same system. And that this sort of positive feedback, you know, I would say prevents us from resilience. And this is why it's so important. In Jack Forbes's Columbus and Other Cannibals, he discusses the Wetiko disease and its cure. Forbes was a professor of Native American scholarship and one of the foremost activists in the 60s and 70s, bringing North American, Native American sort of movement to the fore. And the idea of these positive feedback loops of Wetiko, of never having enough, right, is that Forbes writes, brutality knows no boundaries, greed knows no limits, perversion knows no borders. So if we let these things just go on forever, they'll keep on going on forever. These characteristics all push towards an extreme, always moving forward once the initial infection sets in. This is the disease of the consuming of other creatures' lives and possessions. I call it cannibalism. Right, so the Wendigo in Robin Will Kimmerer's book Braiding Sweetgrass, she talks about this concept as well. In Chinese mythology, you have the Cao Tse, the creature that eats its own body, right? Because it eats the entire world. It's never having enough, the lack of satiety. And so I'd like to suggest here that there are ways out of this, there are alternatives. And part of that is choiceless awareness, right? And sur-réflexion, or the observer becoming the observed, right? And in these traditions that are phenomenological, they're practices of the body, Vipassana is, the fact that we are of existence precedes our ability to know or judge, right? And so being with all the tensions that exist is a way of, I would say, reconciling or making peace with those opposites. So many plants have extrafloral nectaries, right? They're completely not necessary for the plant's basic function, but they feed glucose, they feed sweet nectar to these insects that help them, and then they can cull them with volatile or organic compounds, with these aromatic compounds when they're being infested, say, for example, by a bunch of aphids. So these extrafloral nectaries cultivate these relationships. So how do we feed our symbionts? Not just, you could say, our mutualists and commensalists, but also our would-be parasites, right? And how do we tap into exteroception and exeroception in order to do this? Well, for a long time, we have been pushing others to speak in our language, right? But as Myra Hurd, who spent a year in Lynn Margulis's lab, has written, non-human animals have for some time been overburdened with the task of making sense of human social relations, right? We've been placing the onus of ethical investigation into interspecies communication on them rather than assuming it ourselves. Val Plumwood has likewise echoed that the real communication challenge at this level of interspecies communication is for we humans to learn to communicate with other species on their terms, in their own languages, or in common terms, if possible. And Donna Haraway has also spoken about the contact zone of interspecies dialogue, reminding us that the noun of species differentiation is permanently a verb. How can we differentiate more towards those other beings that we wish to get to know better? In terms of cultivating awareness, I just want to suggest that we can look at the physical faculties, technologies that can help us translate scientific understandings of how species live and interact, the imaginative inquisitiveness, and our desire to listen and understand, and proximity and dedication. So actually showing up reliably, hanging out with the organisms that we want to know better. And that there are different types of listening. We can either listen to affirm the differences, that could be called cataphatic. And we can say, okay, so those differences that we previously looked down upon, now instead we're going to raise them and say that they are valid, as valid as any other way of being. But I would suggest that we focus more of our attention on apophatic or transformative ways of listening, that not just say, okay, so this other that we've been afraid of or haven't understood, and we're saying that their way of being other is equally important or valid as the way that we as an in-group have been doing things, say human and more than human. But instead, apophatic listening transforms the very categories of what it means to be those different things, right? And instead of straight versus gay, it's queering the field. And so I think that looking at these forms of attention that alter our categories is extremely important for moving forward. And we can see that, that there are many ways of being that we often don't see, which doesn't make them less important just because we can't tap into them with our first gloss. So paying attention to the interference patterns can involve looking at how different wavelengths of light affect us, right? When we have outside our homes and you have blue LED lights, that actually harms tree growth and tree health. That's why on the warmer spectrum, more towards red light, it helps trees sleep, just like it helps us sleep. Looking at signal to noise ratios in every technological communication, just as in this medium, but also in my voice, where's the signal and where's the noise? And what can we do in a fractal way as a world of humans living in this chaotic sense to increase the signal and reduce the static? And this, I believe, will bring us to a mindset or state where we have more partnership and less domination. There are many ways to get there, right? We can look at the medicine drums of traditional Native American ceremonies. We can look at the yogic system in India. But we can acknowledge that interdimensional liberation algorithms do exist, that cultures have been using them for thousands of years, that we can see sacrifice of ego as karma burning, and that ecodelic experience we can use ecodelic experience intentionally to let other entities reduce suffering through our engagement with our own or their suffering, simpliciter. It doesn't matter whose suffering it is. Suffering is suffering, so liberate it. And finding aesthetically beautiful ways to make suffering fun, I think, is part of how we do this. So part of how we can do this is through regeneration. If we have destroyed landscapes, maybe, for example, here, like on the lowest plateau in China, 640,000 square kilometers, we can also regenerate it, right? As the picture on your right shows. And we can also stand up for the things that we believe in, because, for example, these hundreds of Bishnois tree huggers who in 1730 died while trying to protect the trees in their village from being turned into raw material for a palace, clung to the trees and were slaughtered by foresters. But their actions led to a royal decree prohibiting the cutting of trees in any Bishnoi village. And now these trees are they're wooded oases amidst an otherwise desert landscape, and have inspired new generations of the Chipko movement in Hindi. Chipko means to cling to the trees, which started in the 70s. So I think that all of our actions matter. And just to close with this slide, this quote from Martin Prechtel: "There is suffering that causes beauty and can lead to a life well led, and then there's suffering that creates more suffering. It's our choice what we wish to do with our lived experience." Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much, Yogi, for that talk. I mean, you covered like a lot of ground. So I'm sure, I mean, there's a lot of overlaps, I know, between what you obviously drew on Ecological, but even in the work of Timo and Augustine, who will be your interlocutors today, I could already see sort of a lot of overlaps, interference patterns, if you will. And I got a lot of messages as well from people who were listening on how fascinating your talk was. So I would like to thank you. I wasn't able to send Yogi's bio at the beginning of the talk, so I'll just be sending it now in the chat so that people know where to follow you and know more about your work. So if you just give me a second, I'll just do that. Right, so thank you everyone for listening to Yogi's talk, and now we'll be moving on to the roundtable session where we will have 4 interlocutors who will, I think, discuss, or give maybe a spontaneous reaction to Yogi's talk that you all heard. So today we'll have 4 interlocutors. So the first, let me just introduce them, and I'll also be sending a more expanded version of their bio in the chat for anyone who'd like to follow them. So yes, our first interlocutor today would be Ecological, who is a biologist and semiotician teaching at the University of Tartu in Estonia. He has been both a field ecologist as well as an ecophysiologist at the Institute of Zoology and Botany, and a biosemiotician at the Institute of Philosophy and Semiotics, where he has worked on theoretical biology, ecological ways of living, and mechanisms of species coexistence. He has developed models of semiosis, or meaning-making processes, and of elementary processes of choice in living systems, and has published hundreds of research articles and many seminal books in the field of biosemiotics. Our second interlocutor for the day will be Timo Maran, who is an Estonian semiotician and poet, as well as a professor of ecosemiotics and environmental humanities at the Department of Semiotics at the University of Tartu, once again at Estonia. His research interests are theory and applications of ecosemiotics, eco-criticism, and Estonian nature writing, and semiotics of biological mimicry. Joining us today as well, we have Agustin Fuentes, who is a professor of anthropology at Princeton University, and their work focuses on the biosocial, delving into the entanglement of biological systems with the social and cultural lives of humans, our ancestors, and a few of the other animals with whom humanity shares close relations. From chasing monkeys in jungles and cities to exploring the lives of our evolutionary ancestors, to examining human health, behavior, and diversity across the globe, he studies what makes humans and our close relations tick, and as well explores cooperation, creativity, and belief in human evolution, multi-species anthropologies, evolutionary theory and processes, and engaging race and racism. And finally, we have the founder and head of AMOR MUNDI, Mayakovskaya, who teaches multi-species Anthropocene studies at Chiang Mai University in the Faculty of Social Sciences. They have published widely on the intersection of the political, the linguistic, and the ecological, with the performative, the semiotic, as well as visual culture. So yes, I'd like to invite our 4 interlocutors, and maybe Ecological, you could perhaps take it away to start with and tell us, or react to Yogi's talk.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks to AMOR MUNDI, and thanks, Yogi, for all these very inspiring ideas and thoughts. So I at first would be pretty brief, just if to try to formulate what Yogi was talking to us in 2 words. I would say that in 2 words, this is against individualism. Individualism. And now, indeed, from a semiotic point of view, life is relational. Life is relational by its very nature. And here you gave many examples towards that, without actually using that term relational, which I think would be useful, because, well, science, semiosis is a relational. now, relational, say you were using synesthetic, but I would probably prefer relational here. Say life is, or that relationality means that semiosis and life's relational aspects means that it's dialogic or rather multi-logic. Now, organism only seems, organism as individual only seems to be individual. So, as Jesper Hofmeyr has emphasized, organism is always a swarm, if to understand biosemiotically now. Even organism itself is a community. To be really radical, that would sort of imply that even concept of living individual would be sort of misleading here. Now, emphasizing that relationality, you just end up in ethical proposals telling us about the importance of partnership. Clearly, of course, we should agree on that. But when looking on the real reasons, real causes of contemporary big problems, contemporary threats to biodiversity, then I think that is not enough. So which could be, say, as friendly as possible, as loving as possible, doing everything in partnership, but that's, so to say, in that truly relational aspects, we cover only our relationships, but not all our results of our action. And that is that besides that relational aspect or semiotic aspect of life, we should also take into account that that biosphere is at the same time doing this chemical cycling, which is based, or organisms are also metabolic systems besides being relational. And that being metabolic system means that we all use energy. And that energetic part now is, well, as necessary as relational for life. And that energetic part has mainly changed during, okay, one say Anthropocene, but during the last century in particular, that energy everybody are using has made a tenfold increase during 1 century per capita. And that is what makes our environment as a result artificial. So, and here is then the major choice or major also opposition, say that's either biodiversity or our action which is using much energy, because that the overusage of energy is what actually is behind the decrease of biodiversity, not even that much of absence of partnership. That's from me from the beginning.
So, Timo or Augustine, would you like to respond to any of those ideas or throw a different one out there? Or
yeah, thank you, Yogi, for very inspirational thought, as always, the ones that you give, and well, many ideas here to ponder. I'm very sympathetic with your kind of general framework, in the sense that we really seem to be not only in environmental crisis, but also in epistemological crisis, and how to find new kind of models of thinking and new modes of perception that would lead us to a different approach, different way of being in the world. It's very, very crucial, and we have very little time for that, as Kalevi told in his remark. But one kind of idea that came into my mind now when listening to you today was that in this transformation, you put a lot of emphasis to psychedelic or ecodelic experiences, and also more kind of traditional native ceremonies and so forth. But what you do not touch for some reason is more kind of classical tools and modes of culture, as for instance poetry or art, and other similar ways that humans have used to make sense of different crises and to reorient them in difficult situations of the world. So that makes me wonder that whether and to what degree these cultural texts, cultural artifacts can still be helpful for us in this current crisis. And this is indeed an open question, because some of them are, it seems, some others are not functional. There's a very interesting direction of research that is called affective eco-criticism, developed by Alexa Wake von Mosner in Austria. And she especially tries to map and measure the effect that different literary texts and poetic texts have for human kind of understandings and human perception of non-human world and non-human nature. So I would kind of argue that this cultural and artistic text, that they may be seen as gateways or kind of windows that also, at least to some extent, help us to transform our ways of approaching a non-human world. And then, of course, moving towards including non-human species and opening up umwelts, as you described, then again, from like this more classical cultural objects, we will have very interesting developments potentially, because when talking about like well, literature and language, we can reach something that is called biotranslation, that is developed by Ecological, the idea that translation also can take place across species borders. And if we think about art and artistic activities and aesthetics, then there is again a movement emerged in perhaps the last 10 or 20 years to do artistic activities across species borders, so that members of our species also included in creating artworks, and that there is some sort of collaboration. So I just wanted to add that perhaps there is like also some possibilities to become engaged in this transformation that derives from a more classical cultural domains. Thank you.
So Yogi, would you like to respond to that, or should we? Maybe Augustine had something to say. I'm sorry I cut you off. So Augustine, please go ahead first.
No. Yogi, do you want to jump in, or do you want me to just sort of lay some more onto the mix?
I'm happy for you all to to share, and and then we can discuss.
Cool. Well, thanks, Yogi. I mean, as always, it's just fantastic to think with, and so many points I'm like, oh, you know what I want to hear, and then you would say it. So I think that was actually a really nice, great use of semantics, a wonderful vocabulary, and just a nice narrative, and I think a wonderful way to lay this argument out. Clevy, cool. Thank you so much for putting relations on the table, because that was the one thing, Yogi, I wanted to see front and center, because I think relations are extremely important in this term, and I have a little bit here that I want to say. And Timo, I really like the idea of sort of what can help here. I think that is the big challenge, right? Because it's one thing to talk about all this; it's another thing to find something to actually do about it. But let me talk about it just really briefly a little bit, because Yogi, you inspired me to think about a few things here. I've been giving a series of presentations lately and sort of am writing something, and I keep coming back to the phrase, it's relations all the way down. And I think that at the heart of it, and this is not my phrase, but it's my interpretation and translation from my collaborations with a number of different indigenous scholars and activists, thinking through how to reframe this kind of discussion. And here, I'll acknowledge, of course, Kim Tallbear, Oyate, Davi Kapanawa, Yanomami, Kyle Powis-White, Potawatomi, who have shaped, I think, and are shaping some of these sort of traditional, sort of Eurocentric, global Northwestern academies into participating in this broader engaging indigenous ecologies of knowledge. Not to classify indigenous as one thing, but to say that these themes of relation actually are not new, right? That many cultures, societies, and ways of knowing have done this. It's just we are now jumping on the bandwagon, and by we, I mean the sort of Western institution. So having said that, what really inspired me here from your talk was this notion that life is messy and in community, always. And that this sort of taking Bateson to heart, right? This pulling apart is actually just a heuristic. It's a traditional heuristic that we've deployed for the sciences, a variety of other different kinds of intellectual, political, and economic rationales. But the pulling apart is a rendering asunder, and a destruction that hinders us from trying to understand these dynamics. Again, I lean heavily into Scott Gilbert and his colleagues' work on the holobiont that I think he wove in there very well. Because at the end of the day, even if we are going to do the science, right, the reductionist science, we're still stuck with communities. You can't ever science your way out of communities. The reductive approach, while good in certain heuristics and models, is completely fallacious, erroneous, and problematic when trying to describe how the world is, which is ecological communities, right? And there's where this tradition of ecosemiotics and biosemiotics becomes very central, because it's about relations all the way down, right? And I would argue that much of what you're proposing, Kul, Maran, and all of us have been talking about, and what AMOR MUNDI has been sort of presenting on this digital stage of late, is this reality that the accumulated knowledge across multiple disciplines of understanding, across multiple ways of knowing, is that the relations are central. And just doing basic ecology, the whole notion that everything lives in community, and then trying to start there rather than end there, or rather than trying to disarticulate some component of that, is I think a central place. So I could go on a lot more about many of the things you brought up. I think person's evolutionary desire is a great place to come back to here, and I think it's a very powerful notion. Again, Bateson's, I think people need to go back and pay attention to Bateson. People have ignored him in the academy for a long time. And I'll just, finally just acknowledge what I think is so important that you sort of veered into in the end there. We're queering our intellectual and theoretical approach and thinking about really capitalism and sort of global political dynamics as a central factor in disruption that has to be included and participatory. in this discussion, right? We can't, I can't talk about local ecosystems without talking about global capitalism. It doesn't work. Yet the challenge, as you noted, is enormous. And Timo, as you said, well, what tools do we bring to this challenge, right? It's one thing to theorize about it. It's another thing to do something about it. And I'm not sure that theorizing and doing are always concordant. So that was just an enormous amount of thoughts, and I have more here, but I wanted to put those on the table. And thank you for stimulating them.
I'd love to throw in a couple more threads to make it even more complicated to respond, but maybe also to simplify by finding some resonances across some of the things that have been said. That was an incredibly rich talk with so many different thematics that you brought together into one that, of course, demand us to investigate further and dig into the implications of many of the claims that you've made and the ways of looking and understanding the world-making processes that you've discussed. I loved that you talked at the end against heroics, thinking of Ursula K. Le Guin's carrier bag theory of fiction and history, and thinking about how that ethos that no longer foregrounds Anthropos as this heroic world-making, exceptional world-making master of nature, which is, of course, part of the historical cultural background of the reason we're in the mess that we're in, and against the heroics to bring that ethos of the carrier bag, of this unseen, or as Nora Bateson talks about, the Aphanipoiesis, the unseen poiesis layer, an element of world making that is constitutive of so much of what we actually do and can see, but is often elided by the ways in which the dominant ways of understanding things, which we have to find our way out of, not just to think our way out of them, but also to see and practice or enact our way out of them pragmatically, to instantiate those changes in both our research practices, drawing on ecosemiotic tools, and also on how we live as beings, particularly as ecological beings. And I loved also what Kalevi said about the metabolic and the relational both, that we have to think about both of these. And that strikes me as an affordance for us to think about an ecological space and dynamic in which actually the metabolic and the relational come together. And that is in the trophic relation, or the trophic relationality within an ecosystem that forms both the energetic and metabolic core of energy exchange, but is also, I think, an exemplary space for looking at ecosemiotic indices, for example, of transformation, and at the same time pinpointing, because of the relationality, the causal ties of our entanglements that happen through the web of life, through the energy exchange, through the food web, that the dominant anthropo-supremacist, capitalist, plantation-ocene, et cetera, ocene has gotten in the way of us, and helped taken us out of a sort of ecological mode of being or citizenship, and moved us into this strange space. This is exclusion zone where we stand outside the web of life as if we were there, and yet, of course, we're not. And I'm just thinking about what Val Plumwood has done in her work on death and her work on the body decomposition, and Deborah Birdrose as well, as really vital ecosemiotic processes that bring that circle all the way around, in which capitalism, intensive animal agriculture, and the ways in which we fragment habitats and destroy a lot of the spaces in which ecosemiotic resonance can happen, and collaborative multi-species niche construction can happen, that we need to not only rethink how to understand these processes and how they causally do connect very specifically in order to come up with useful remediations, but also to think about what they suggest for how do we re-envision what it means to be human in a more than human world, and to be ecological beings once again, something that we both cannot help but be, and yet we resist it so intensely in the ways that we enact. And I loved what Timo said about bringing in art and poetry and other forms of aesthetics. A lot of people, I think, misunderstand what aesthetics is and think it's only about the beautiful or what's beautiful. I know Kalevi's also done really important work on the biosemiotics of aesthetics. And I think it's important to think about the political side of the aesthetic as well, as the forms that become visible. So it's working to, aesthetic forms can render what is funny poetic, what is invisibilized or not seen, render it visible or foregrounded, or bring it to the fore, so that we can both think about it and then enact other versions of it, or with it make the world differently. So there's all kinds of provocations that have come out of your talk and the comments. And I guess what I would love to get out of this conversation is to think together more about just how it is that ecosemiotics, both as a practice of study of ecological world-making processes, and also ecosemiotics as a mechanism of world-making, a more than human world-making, how we can think about how attentiveness to symbiosis, symbiogenesis, symbiosis, and symbiopoiesis can help us better study this world-making process in a way that can overturn or decenter that hero of Anthropos narrative and bring us back into the sort of carry your bag, unseen, uncelebrated, but maybe most important way of being human and making the world with the more than human that has always been there, but needs to be recentered as a way of being human. I'm curious to hear what you all think about how we deal with the crisis we're in using ecosemiotics to help us. You're muted.
Yeah, so Yogi, would you like to respond? Also, I think Maya's, question was general enough for, I think,
Yes.
all of you to, think about, and I saw Kalevi also nodding along. So if perhaps first Yogi and then maybe the rest could respond, that would be great.
Sure, I'll just briefly try to, I can't do justice to all the ideas in there, but just want to say thank you for thinking along with me and supporting my thinking on these issues. So yeah, maybe I'll start with Maya. I love Nora Bateson's notion of philosophosis and this, this attending to those things that we didn't even know that we needed to attend to, and this sort of opening of the imaginal realm through also practice, right? I think that it's no coincidence that Peirce is not only the founder of this type of triadic semiotics, but also pragmatism, right? And so as far as I see pragmatism, there's this pull beyond sort of a theory action split, right? The idea that theoria and the vita activa are somehow separate. And I see that partially in Peirce's quirkiness himself. And one of the notions that I have been enjoying toying with is getting beyond this idea of performing humanists, right? That there is perhaps this crypto-normative notion of human that we feel that we're forced to perform via centuries of colonialism, of you could say first in Europe. Eric Wolf's Europe and the People Without History is a great look at how Europe came into this closing down of diversity of language, of religion, of culture, of paganism with the environment, and then that once that project was completed, it spread around the world in Wetiko fashion. I think that there's resonances here with Hart and Negri's empire, right? How do nations become created? Because there is no nation. There's this regionality. There's this, if it's relations all the way down, it's also there's difference all the way down, and attending to these the particularities which come when there is, you could say, the letting up of downward pressure, right, and control. the letting up of that, when we stop grazing areas or overgrazing areas, ecosystems find their ways to slowly, through succession, rebuild themselves, right? And at first it might look like just a bunch of weeds, but actually that's sowing the soil for trees and more complexity. And so, aesthetics, and I find that architecture is a big one for me right now, because it's, I remember hearing as a kid, Anita Franco had this song, I'm no heroine, and she says, who says I like right angles? These are not my laws, these are not my rules. And there's this idea that, we've created a one-size-fits-all Euclidean geometry, when there's also non-Euclidean geometry. And I think the field of biomimicry in architecture, in product design, in industrial ecology are extremely important to get us to the other side, not just so that we can create more and have a sort of Jevons paradox of being able to use even more energy, but realize how little we actually need and how inefficient we've actually been in the age of fossil fuels, which has allowed for all this hierarchization, right? Not hierarchies of actualizing things, but hierarchies of domination. So yeah, and carrier bag theory of fiction absolutely is near and dear to my heart. And I think that what does it mean to be ordinary? How do we get out of this idea of needing to be a millionaire or billionaire or famous on TikTok or whatever it is? And what draws us to that, I believe, is this sort of anthropological need for recognition. And so that's why when I DJ, I generally DJ most of the music of people who I know personally, like my friends, because I love their music and it's danceable. And this idea of local heroes, right? The people, when we all regard each other and we can recognize each other, we can begin to know who we are, because other people can recognize our daemon, right? As Hannah Arendt talks about it. And when we have our daemon recognized, we tend to be more at peace and be able to recognize others as well. And so it becomes this reciprocal relation of recognition rather than one of anonymity. Augustine, I love this, you can't ever science yourself out of community. That is a wonderful encapsulation of, I think, what is at foot at the moment in the natural sciences, is this sort of very queering of previous structures that, we're basically preaching a story of separation and individualism, and now we're seeing that it is all relations all the way down, as you say. So thank you for that. Timo, this notion of affective eco-criticism, again, given that you write your poetry in Estonian, I also really feel that there's an audience for certain affect, right, in art, right? And it's cultivating those audiences, not to have a general heterogeneous audience, but rather, you talked about how different texts have different affective qualities, and I think that will always be a particular thing, right? Because I think what we want to get away from is the text that has the same effect on everybody, right? Because we might lose some of the dimensionality in such a text, and how language plays and different media play different roles. I absolutely feel very strongly that art, I'm a musician myself, poetry, they play incredibly important roles in this transition that we're undergoing right now. I've talked to some deans and directors and all these top people in universities and corporations, and say, so what do we do? How do we get out of this? And oftentimes I hear art, we need to make our messages sexy. We need to make things beautiful. We need to fully sink our teeth into the types of expression that we love and share them with our loved ones. And, they might catch on, right? Advertisers still can't ever best, word of mouth and, how we relate stories to each other, because we're so creative natively. And Kalevi, absolutely, the metabolic and the relational, as Maya encapsulated some of what you're discussing. I would also want to just make a little bit more precise. Sort of my concern is not per se the per capita tenfold increase, but where that has been distributed globally, right? And so, us who are using all these digital technologies every day, the notion that a private jet and a billionaire, for example, uses as much energy as hundreds of thousands of people in a year, right? So that yes, we have all used more energy as a species, but that has not been equally distributed. And that I think that that's a huge part of the puzzle, because a lot of like contract and converge models of energy use, reducing emissions and reducing energy use, have to do with finding ways that allow everybody to flourish and thrive, but contracting our total energy use and converging globally in our energy use, so that it's not some of us using hundreds of thousands of times more energy than somebody else. Yeah, thank you all.
Great. So once again, back to our panelists, would anyone like to respond maybe for a bit, or should I open, the floor for questions from the other listeners as well?
Can I jump in? Just very, very briefly, just to continue this, and one more point that I think is really important about the sciencing and this engagement, I think that relates to all of this, and that is that the contemporary sort of evolutionary sciences, you mentioned the extended evolutionary synthesis and thinking through these things. I think it's very important to point out that this idea of the focus on systems as only sort of reductionable, right? That is this reductionist approach, this adaptationist approach, the notion that function helps us more than other explanations, I think is being pushed back against a lot. And you described this a little bit early on in the talk, and I just wanted to put again on the table this idea that drift and epiphenomena are ubiquitous across community and evolutionary dynamics. And so when we speak about evolution, we're not just talking about function, adaptation, or trait-specific reductionist approaches. And I think that's also an opening, right? This idea that evolutionary theory has caught up to many other ways of knowing in the current moment, which I think is particularly important.
If I may say about the ecosemiotics as such, say one of the central themes, I think, for ecosemiotics as a field of research is to try to explain and understand why human species, among all meaning-making species, are the most tragic one. So, so here I like that you also pointed out Terence Deacon's that symbolic species main scheme from there, which explains that, namely symbolic relation as different from indexical or iconic, makes it possible to radically decontextualize our behavior and our decisions, say, which is a sort of difference in case of humans, according to Terence Deacon. And here in this connection, I would say comment Renzo Filinic's say sentence in our chat, saying that today biodiversity must be seen from a techno-diversity. In this sense, also opens the possibility of a no diversity. So here, indeed, that symbolic capacity of humans increases in some way diversity incredibly. However, look, whether now we really like to have this incredible diversity of motor vehicles, or we value biodiversity. So, and that is the real question. So that that diversity, what we get through the incredible increase in consumption of energy, via which we build all this diversity of artifacts, say, is whether we want it to replace biodiversity, because the problem is that it is replacing now biodiversity. Timo.
Yeah, I would like to throw in another angle and continue with tragedy, as you mentioned that, and also Maya told us that if we talk about aesthetics, then it's always not about beautiful, but like different ways of thinking about aesthetics. And I'm kind of very happy about that Yogi's talk and your writing as well has such a kind of positive, transformative potential that you really kind of see the way how we, or kind of indicate the way how to go forward from there. But at the same time, seeing the world around us and how much kind of ecological destruction and how much broken ecological relations are there, it's also very important to kind of embrace this and thinking in the lines of like Donna Haraway, Staying with the Trouble, or Andrew Whitehouse, who has spoken about semiotic anxiety or anxious semiotics as a kind of tool of making sense of the world around us. So yes, having this contact or thinking along and feeling along with the broken relations and seeing also ourselves as broken, that's also an important part of this story. So yeah, I just got the feeling that it's something that should be added here, because otherwise, well, it's good to have this positive outlook and to work towards like better cooperation and relations in the future, but not to kind of block away this tragedy. And then Yogi also made a relation with suffering and kind of working with the suffering, and for me, words of Leonard Cohen are very close to heart, that there's a crack in everything, and that's how light gets in. So that's something to kind of bear in mind, this tragic aspect of all that as well. Thanks.
Right. So Maya, would you like to say anything further?
Sure, but if we have also any questions, we can also throw some of those in. Or if you have a comment, you've also done a lot of work on aesthetics as well.
Yeah, but from a completely different tradition. But actually, what I was more wondering about was, I was actually thinking about how Yogi views parasitism, because I mean, that was there in the title of the talk as well. And he spoke about it when he was looking at Deacon's The Symbolic Species. Because I'm sorry. Oh gosh, my camera is off. 1 second. But yeah, because I was thinking about it along Timo's work. I know Timo is drawn on parasitism in the work of Michel Serres. And Timo sees parasitism almost as something productive, as something that can disrupt symbolic systems which are, too closed in on themselves and which have sort of abstracted themselves too far from reality. Well, Yogi almost seems to, there's more a resonance rather than dissonance, if I could use those terms, since those were in the title of your talk. So Yogi, I was wondering how you think exactly of parasitism, and if you could tell me a bit more about, tell us a bit more about that.
Sure. Thanks for picking up on that, Anshul, because there is so much ambiguity, right? On the one hand, parasitism can kill. It does kill. It can overwhelm, right? You have aphids that can destroy plants, grasshoppers that can wipe out entire crops, monoculture usually, but that doesn't change the effects of parasitism. Is wiping out, right? And parasites can also show us unsustainable ways of living. And so I see the parasite as this amorphous being, right, that isn't ever static because it's relational, right? So, for example, in some contexts, you have a species in an ecosystem that is parasitic, and in other circumstances and other ecologies, it can be commensual or mutualistic. It's not an ontological status. And I think that this is really important too, because this isn't some sort of redemptive narrative of the heroic parasite or of others changing things. It's rather attuning to how automatic so much of symbiosis is. And I don't just say this for the more than human world. I, in my work, have stressed the automaticity of human behavior, right? That we're probably 90 to 99% automatic in our behavior, working from our basal ganglia, not our prefrontal cortex. If we had to tie our shoes, and be conscious of it every time, we wouldn't even leave the house, right? If we had to consciously do everything, right? So automaticity is not a bad thing. It's part of how all life works, right? We have these habits, we have these grooves, we have these heuristics, which we work with in order to approximate, in order to do things while we're thinking about something. It's cognitive offloading, and it's really necessary and useful. But when we don't realize that we're doing that, and the things that we're doing actually hurt others in one way or another, then our behavior can unwittingly, in these cases, be harmful, right? Be a form of parasitism, be a form of wetiko also. And so I like looking at sort of the Buddhist notion of parasitism, where, when you have the prayer, may all beings be free of suffering. That means may the parasites also be free of whatever's parasitizing them that makes them parasites. And may those parasites that are parasitizing them be also free from suffering. So it's, again, relations all the way down. And so we get to this place of, for me, it's more of a matter of designing ecologies, not to say that we are the owners of this, that we, are godlike in the sense that we can design ecologies from our mind's eye, but rather that we need to co-design our habitats with all the other cohabitants in ways that serve the needs of all those cohabitants. And that, to me, is a form of anti-parasitism, because it doesn't create the bully chicken that has to be a bully chicken, right? Instead, you have a habitat that allows all the chickens to produce eggs in a way that produces a lot of eggs, and they're happy. Going back to that experiment of William Muir, which I pointed out in the slide. So that's sort of how I see some of these aspects playing out.
Very briefly, So from ecological point of view, this is would be a wrong idea to get free of diseases or parasites or alike. So because if we would get free of diseases, then we would lose immunity. So completely. So therefore, they have very, very important part in our biosphere, in our ecosystem. So that's just a brief comment. Otherwise, I agree, of course, what you are talking.
Absolutely. The book, An Evolution of Absence, talks about, when we live in this sort of sanitary revolution, that can open the door for all sorts of other sicknesses. And that's why people have fecal transplants and get hookworms implanted in them, right? Which traditionally are parasites, in order to have these protective values as well. Augustine?
There's a vocabulary issue here that I think it's really important, that we're stuck using this sort of capitalistic competitive regime as the discourse, right? So it's a conflict between the parasite and the host, rather than different kinds of relations, right? It could be extractive relations, could be different kinds of, and that's the disease context as well, right? Diseases are part of these dynamic ecological relationships that are mutually mutable over time. Yet we always tend to think about this cost-benefit analysis. And in a cost-benefit analysis, it's always about conflict, right? You cannot describe it without conflict. So pushing away from those terms and thinking about these relations, I think, is really important. It doesn't deny the potential damage done in these relations, but it does reframe it away from, I think, this very cost-benefit competition model, which is limited.
Drawing on the idea of a collaborative aesthetics as a potential way to sort of address these kinds of issues, and thinking about what you said, Yogi, about parasitism being relational all the way down. I mean, isn't it really a question of the index ground shifting in ways that transform that relationship, right? And I'm thinking of work that Augustine has done about belief and legisigns, and thinking about the capacity to collectively and collaboratively imagine things that don't exist, and then to find ways pragmatically and through practice and coordinated action and relationship transformation, a kind of transcontextual creation of new imaginaries that then can be enacted or embodied, so that the sign, the word, the sign becomes lived embodied flesh or pragmatic, experiential reality, and becomes the new set of principles that organize and order the dominant mode of relationality. And sort of thinking about collaborative aesthetics, like what Timo mentioned, with other than human beings, as one way to no longer make art be a sort of a representational about, making art about that represents this other world, but rather collaboratively making art with more than human beings in a way that foregrounds their agential capacity and allows us humans, who are the benighted ones, I think, in this story, to start to see and understand the world-making capacities, the agential capacities, through ecosemiotic relationships and ecosemiosis as niche co-construction mechanism, an evolutionary mechanism, even, as Augustine's written about, and some of you others have written about as well, as a way to participate in creating new systems of relationality that hopefully can unseat the sick one that we are currently sort of struggling with right now. I don't know if you have thoughts on that, any of you, but thinking about the capacity to collectively imagine that which does not exist and then make it so. How can we bring that capacity, which surely also exists in the more than human world? How can we bring that coordinated, relational, collaborative, aesthetic making project of making new frames and paradigms for understanding how we relate and how we can coexist together? Could be a really exciting way to move forward in this field across multiple disciplines that none of us can do in our silos alone, but that can create the possibilities of active world-making projects that can teach us also to be better humans differently than maybe we have learned to do so far. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on
Or
any
better persons, I think better persons. I think it's a good, you know, the whole idea of personhood and the human, I think is a good way to also push against this concept a little bit as well.
Well, I also think that I don't know how the personhood discussion works for in most of your work, but I think that understanding the agential capacity and the selfhood of other beings other than human beings is a way of also extending the personhood beyond the human. So when I say human instead of person, it's specifically to delimit or to break the delimiting of personhood within the human and extend it, a different kind of extended evolutionary synthesis, as it were. Yeah, to see that and understand that. Wondering if we have questions from the audience.
Yeah, so yeah, actually, Maya, your comments on, I mean, I think aesthetics and relationality are the perfect springboard for this, because I think we have a bunch of people asking about art relationality and aesthetics. So I think the first question is from Veer, who had a question regarding relational ontologies and how they promote flourishing, not only in conjunction with art, but also work, I think, against art's reification. He talks about how under modernity, art has been more recently reduced to mere cultural decoration, and it doesn't really come into relation with the real. So he was wondering what the panel's thoughts are on that, and what relationality has to do for reinvigorating perhaps art's position today, and how we can think of art in these relational ecosemiotic terms, rather than just a reified cultural commodity that has sort of been locked away and locked up, I think, as perhaps Hito Ster has documented in duty-free art and other places.
Just very briefly, one of the ideas of art I feel is, you know, living one's life as a work of art in a performative way, which is interspecies and queer, right? So what do I mean by interspecies queer? I mean, getting past the notion that we have to show up in any sort of particular way to be granted rights as a human being, so that we can take on more plant-like or, I don't know, dog-like or whatever qualities, and still be a full member of the human world. But, you know, I do think that there is a, you could say, to a certain degree, perhaps a zero-sum game when it comes in terms of performance, right? And so that means if I really want to learn how to be more fungal and spend my time in the roots and, you know, in the wilds, that I might lose some of the refinements of being a scholar in the ivory tower, and that needs to be okay in a society that allows people to learn different pigeons and to maybe forget some of the languages here to learn some of the symbiosis there.
And would anyone else like to respond to that, or should we have, I think, a few more questions? We have another question from Kat, who has asked, how can these ways of listening to and with the other be brought to bear within the more time-critical situations that are facing us today, such as, for example, in land use planning? And Kat is thinking along the lines of Fritz Haig's animal estates, moving towards a real collaboration with the more than human stakeholders with which landscapes are shared. So would anyone like to, respond to, I think Kat's essential point is, given sort of the immediacy of the climate crisis, how can we sort of actualize the ecosemiotic ways of thinking that we've been talking about in situations that perhaps don't give us as much sort of leeway to learn and think and acquire the pigeons, as Yogi said. So yeah, that was, I think, the question. So if anyone, I think, not just Yogi, I think it was the entire panel, would like to respond, yeah, now.
Maybe so in responding just in one aspect, and that's more aesthetic. So Yogi has in its title already spoken about multidimensionality, say, or we can also say a multi-relationality. So that's living beings in, well, let's say, in a way, except humans, so in ecosystems, have to be fitted in absolutely each and every aspect of their life to all the others in surrounding. And now what here everybody who are now speaking and looking around in its room say there are almost no other Augustine maybe has a dog, but say there are no other species around. So we have killed, we have not allowed into a room, so almost anybody. So, and that's so clean, so incredibly clean. So, and we should just somehow notice that, say, well, pathological cleanness with which we have surrounded us. And this is namely that due to our capacity, we are so clever, we can invent the ways to do that, say, and but at the same time, say, we lose, say, all this fittedness to all other creatures, all other ways of meaning making. And so that's here, I think that is in a way aesthetic aspect, and including up to the landscape, say, where we shouldn't make landscape built of only, say, non-living material. So that's but that's very much now our own choice, how much space we will leave to all these other species. And the only way actually to leave them the space would be energetic degrowth.
I would like to add that one kind of practical method that can be used is Umwelt theory and everything that arises from that, because Jakob van Uxkull's Umwelt theory also is one of foundations of ecosemiotics, and Yogi also in his talk mentioned this opening up umwelts. So basically, well, if we are talking about like urban design or landscapes or other these type of domains, then using Umwelt approach, making Umwelt analysis, how the given place, how the given location is seen and used from the perspective of different Umwelts, and through that incorporating the competencies of non-human species into our designs. So this is one very practical, very doable thing that could be used. And also when to think about aesthetics and kind of cohabitation from this perspective, Jakob van Uxkull has one interesting concept that is not very much used, and this is tolerance of meaning. And what he means is that if we are living together with our species, then it's not only us that are attributing meanings to other living creatures, but other living creatures are attributing meanings to us as well. And sometimes this is supportive, sometimes this is kind of neutral, sometimes it's a bit unpleasant. And now the question would be that what sort of meanings we kind of can tolerate and what is too much. But at the same time, it's also possible to interpret this from a positive perspective, because every such meaning attribution also somehow constrains us and puts some boundaries to us and gives some scaffolds, if we use the concept by Jesper Hoffmeyer. So this attributions, these meanings that other living creatures give to us, they also can be very beneficial for a kind of living and evolving together. So, and this, I think, has to do with aesthetics and how to kind of playfully engage with non-humans.
This is, I really apologize. It's morning here where I am, and I have to go onto campus to do teaching and the normal day's work. So I have to go, but I just love this last bit here, the aesthetics, this overlap, this sort of redesign approach. Kalevi, Yogi, and Timo, you're really pointing out, I think, the nuts and bolts of overlapping Umwelten, which exist. It's about recognizing and actually making them part of our lived experience, right? This kind of mutual mutability as always there, but maybe to be more generous from our end on how we engage that. So thanks so much. And thanks everyone for this wonderful conversation. Yogi, for this incredible provocation. I really enjoyed it. I'm sorry I have to run now, but it's off to work on a Tuesday morning. So take care, everyone. And thank you so much,
Augustine, for giving us your time so early in the morning. And then we look forward to having you give a talk sometime in the not too far future, I hope. Have a good one.
Sounds good. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
So,
And yeah, so just, I think maybe we should also start wrapping up. We've just got one last question from Abu Bakr Muhammad Jamal, where I think, Yogi, he's maybe taken exception also with one of with how you phrase things, where he asks about how apt the word regenerative is, because it implies almost a complete resurrection rather than responsibility taking. And is it better to say rehabilitation, akin to, for example, a criminal process where we recognize harm done and things lost, or, for example, compare it to decolonization? And I think, Yogi, you also did touch briefly on that in one of your last slides, where we were talking about how humans have placed sort of an almost inordinate pressure on the modern human world to understand our ways of meaning making. And I think now reparations sort of are in order. So yeah, that was his question. So if you could quickly respond to that.
Of course, thank you so much for the question. This mode of regeneration versus what was the phrase used? Not reparations.
Rehabilitation, yeah.
Rehabilitation. Yes. I think that acknowledging the brokenness is important, because it means that we can't go back in time and fix things just because now we suddenly have the sort of ethical awareness or the technological ability or whatever else it is. That we have to acknowledge history, right? And part of acknowledging history, I think, is a sort of reparations, to be honest, in all senses. And so, what can we do to rehabilitate areas species that we have harmed? I think part of it's a question of scale, and this sort of might dovetail with Kat's question, and that is that if we want to have sort of interspecies collaboration on how to best have land use or design habitats, that we need to simply realize that we're through all of our extensive needs for just-in-time, sort of ready at hand, all that Heidegger's critique of technology stuff, we really need to provide more space. The Convention on Biodiversity is aiming for 30% of land for biodiversity. Maybe that's not enough, right? Classic areas here, like thinkers like Arnie Ness, for example, would say, well, maybe we constrain human activity to 1/3 of our terrestrial and sort of oceanic space. And then we leave another third to visit, to be in dialogue, to be in interspecies connection with, where we do not alter it, and we just let it happen, and we let the happening of us happening with these other species be its own sort of space. And then we leave 1/3 that we completely don't even visit, right? That we have as these shrines of difference, that we allow our own curiosity to have some limits, and we don't even interact with them, and we allow that space for the whatever species, whatever elements, whatever others are there to do their thing on their own terms. And so I think that scale is a really important piece, because if we're trying to have, a rambunctious garden in a corner of real estate that's surrounded by polluting factories, like it just ain't going to do the work. So what are concrete ways that we can sort of decolonize these Euclidean geometries, right? Our architectures that are not biomimicking. I think that this is a part of the grand questions that we face. How can we create areas of human life where we can have interspecies interaction, where it's okay for wolves to occasionally eat some of the sheep, and that we as a community sort of reimburse that farmer instead of killing off the wolves, for a very concrete example. How do we increase our tolerance to go back to what Timo was mentioning about Jakob van Uxkel's phrase, how do we increase our tolerance for other species' needs for meaning? And I think part of that is finding ways to support ourselves as a species, to support ourselves when we are at a loss because a tree falls on our car or something like that, so that we can evenly distribute the harms that may happen occasionally, so that we don't have this nervous sort of trigger happy trauma response every time that nature invades our space, right? And have more reciprocity there with those relations.
Kalevi and Timo, would you like to have any last comments before we wrap? We're going to have to wrap this up here quickly here, but is there any last thoughts you'd like to share?
There is so much still to study in the field of ecosemiotics. Thank you. Thank you, very good. Thank you for your talk.
Very glad to be the part of this dialogue or monologue, and well, we will continue. We need to continue in developing this, and it's absolutely like necessary and also very kind of enjoyable journey.
Yeah, thank you so much, Yogi. You've given us so much to think about that we can only scratch the surface today, but I hope that these conversations will continue. And I love that you ended with helping us think about the ways in which we might come to understand ourselves differently.